While attending his daughter's ballet recital, the millionaire froze when he spotted one of the ballet instructors wearing his mother's golden locket. Her story made him shiver. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Alexander adjusted the crisp cuffs of his tailored suit, his mind already circling tomorrow's boardroom agenda. Yet tonight, he forced himself to step out of the whirlwind of deals and mergers to be there for Ava. His daughter, with her curious eyes and wild, honey-brown curls, was one of the few anchors in his life that kept him grounded. The theater buzzed with excitement, parents exchanging proud glances, siblings tugging at sleeves, and the lights casting a golden glow over velvet seats. Alexander scanned the room, finding his own seat and slipping into it with a measured breath. The grand stage, framed by sweeping curtains and lit by gentle spotlights, was a stark reminder of his mother. He hadn't stepped foot in a place like this since he was a boy, when she used to drag him to concerts and plays, eyes dancing with excitement. The recital commenced. Tiny ballerinas tiptoed onto the stage, their tutus a sea of pastel hues. Ava was at the center, her focus evident as she raised her arms and moved with surprising grace. Alexander's usually guarded face softened, pride flickering in his eyes. As the music swelled and filled the theater, a line of instructors glided in to guide the dancers. It was then that Alexander's gaze locked onto one of them, a young woman with a confident, fluid stride and an air of calm. Something about her seemed to pull at a part of him he didn't quite recognize. But what caught him most was the gold chain glinting at her collarbone, holding a familiar locket. His chest tightened as if bound by an unseen force. That locket, it had once belonged to his mother. The same locket he'd clasped around her neck on her birthday, with a child's proud declaration that she'd always have a piece of him. And there it was, now resting on a stranger's throat, as if time had bent backward and skipped across years of grief and silence. The performance ended in a sweep of applause, but Alexander barely heard it. His eyes remained fixed on the young woman, whose smile was kind and fleeting as she gathered the dancers for a final bow. Ava waved in his direction, bright-eyed and flushed with joy, but even her triumphant grin barely pierced through the fog that had enveloped him. Alexander clapped automatically, willing his racing heart to steady. Questions seared through his mind. How could she possibly have his mother's locket? And who was she? The recital might have concluded for everyone else, but for Alexander, the night had only just begun. The applause reverberated around the theater, and parents leaned forward to take pictures of their beaming children. Alexander sat frozen, his gaze locked onto the young woman standing at the edge of the stage. Her movements were fluid, confident, but it wasn't her grace that had him rooted to the spot. It was the delicate, golden locket glistening at her collarbone, a sight that sent a cold rush down his spine. That locket, with its intricate swirls and tiny, heart-shaped clasp, was unmistakable. It had once belonged to his mother. Time seemed to splinter and twist. The walls of the theater faded to a muted backdrop, and Alexander was a boy again, barely taller than the antique table in the family parlor. The sun poured through the wide windows, lighting up the polished wood floors and catching the glimmer of the locket he held out in his small, trembling hands. His mother's face, soft and luminous, broke into a delighted smile. "For me," she had said, bending down so their eyes met. The look of pride and love in her gaze had been worth every penny he'd saved to buy it. "Yes, Mama," he had whispered, a blush creeping up his cheeks. He remembered how her slender fingers guided his hands to fasten the clasp around her neck. The locket settled against her skin, glowing as if it belonged there, completing the picture of elegance she always embodied. She'd touched it often, absent-mindedly, as if its presence reassured her. A loud cheer from the front row snapped him back into the present, the memory slipping like water through his fingers. His chest tightened as the room spun, the years between that moment and now closing in with suffocating force. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake the sudden dizziness, the hard line of reality blurring at the edges. Alexander's childhood had been a delicate blend of warmth and distance, like the early morning sun that never quite breaks through the fog. The family estate, with its ivy-draped walls and sprawling gardens, was both a playground and a fortress. He'd spent countless hours running through mazes of hedges, the laughter of his mother echoing as she called him back for tea. His father, however, was a different force, a stern man who viewed tenderness as a weakness. Their household was a careful dance of affection and formality, where love was spoken more through gestures than words. His mother had been the heart of the estate, her presence filling every corner with light. She would read to him by the fire, voice soft and lilting, or teach him piano in the great hall where every note resonated with her encouragement. But there were days when Alexander caught her gazing out the window, eyes distant as if seeing a memory only she knew. He had never dared to ask, too young to understand that the shadows she wore were more than just the day's exhaustion. The locket was her most treasured possession. He remembered the day he'd saved up his allowance to buy it, a simple token of his love. The look on her face when he clasped it around her neck was seared into his mind, a mix of joy and something unspoken, as if she had received a message he could not yet comprehend. It became her constant companion, shimmering softly against her skin until the day she vanished from his life, leaving behind a hole that never quite healed. After her death, the estate's once lively corridors turned cold and unfamiliar. Alexander grew up under the watchful eye of nannies and tutors, but none could replicate the comfort of his mother's touch or her lilting laugh. His father, consumed by grief and his own mysteries, retreated further into silence. Alexander learned to rely on himself, building walls as intricate and unyielding as the estate's architecture. Despite the loneliness that threaded through his teenage years, he vowed that if he ever had a family, he would not let it be defined by absence. His mother's memory became both a guide and a cautionary tale, pushing him toward a life where success meant more than boardroom victories and bottom lines. When he finally built his empire, family remained a cornerstone he refused to compromise on. He made a habit of carving out moments for those he loved, no matter how relentless his schedule became. Whether it was flying home for Ava's school events or setting up family dinners that mimicked the warmth his mother once cultivated, he knew time was the most valuable asset he had. With Ava, he read stories in her brightly decorated room, her giggles echoing the joy that once filled the estate. Alexander's attention to family wasn't just an act of nostalgia, it was a redemption, a way to rebuild what had been lost. He'd vowed that Ava would never know the cold comfort of an empty house or the ache of unsaid words. Every recital, every bedtime story, was a reminder that his mother's legacy would be one of presence, not just of things left unsaid or unresolved. But tonight, seeing the locket, it was as if all his efforts to create a warm, secure world for Ava were suddenly inadequate. The questions resurfaced, gnawing at him with a tenacity he hadn't felt since he was a boy. This time, he wasn't just a child left to wonder. This time, he would find answers. The locket had disappeared on the night his mother died, vanishing along with any clear answers about her death. It had been the silent question that loomed over his teenage years, an unanswered riddle that kept him awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling while the shadows whispered doubts he couldn't voice. His father's terse dismissal, the unwillingness to delve into the truth, left Alexander to grow up haunted by what-ifs and fragmented memories. And now, here it was, resting against the neck of a stranger as if it hadn't vanished from his life. Eliza, as the program had named her, moved with practiced precision as she led the young dancers into their final positions. She lifted her arm gracefully, directing their bows, oblivious to the storm of emotions she had stirred. Alexander's jaw clenched as his mind raced. Was it just a coincidence, a piece bought in a forgotten estate sale? Or was there something more hidden in its presence here, something that could unravel the web of half-answers and silence he had accepted for too long? He leaned forward, gripping the armrests, a million questions buzzing like static in his ears. How did she get it? Why had it surfaced now, years later, in this very theater? The chatter of parents praising their children's performances filled the space around him, but it was all distant noise, drowned by the thundering in his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, another memory clawing its way to the surface. It was the last time he'd seen her wearing it. She'd been at the piano, the evening light slanting across the room and painting her in shades of gold. Her fingers had drifted over the keys, playing a piece that wove through the air with a hauntingly beautiful melody. He had stood in the doorway, too young to understand the sadness shadowing her face, too naive to question the tremor in her voice when she called him over and kissed the top of his head. The next morning, she was gone. The thought of that night still sent a chill down his spine. He'd woken to the muted hum of whispers and hurried footsteps. The look on the butler's face when he found Alexander pacing the hallway was one he would never forget, strained, eyes cast downward as if afraid of what they might reveal. The locket was never found, and his father's curt assurance that some things are better left undisturbed sealed the silence like a tomb. Alexander's focus sharpened again on Eliza. The recital had concluded, and the performers were streaming off stage, some squealing in delight, others rushing to their parents' open arms. Eliza lingered, directing the flow of children and offering soft encouragements. The locket glinted once more in the overhead lights, catching the final notes of a piano piece played by one of the older students. He felt the room sway as memories and reality collided, each one demanding space. He stood abruptly, the sudden movement drawing curious glances from the families around him. Alexander hardly noticed, his entire being drawn toward the woman wearing the small, golden piece that had once symbolized safety, love, and unanswered loss. He moved down the aisle, each step heavy with a mix of dread and determination. The closer he got, the clearer it became that tonight would change everything. As he approached the stage, Eliza turned slightly, the easy smile she wore fading as she met his intense gaze. Her hand moved to the locket, an unconscious gesture that only deepened the tightness in his chest. For an instant, there was only silence between them, as if the room held its breath, waiting. The applause had tapered off, and the theater began to empty, but Alexander stood rooted to the spot, eyes locked on Eliza as she ushered the last of the children toward their parents. His heart pounded against his ribs as he fought to keep his composure. Each second that passed felt like a battle between restraint and the desperation clawing at him. Eliza's cheerful demeanor shifted the moment she noticed him approaching. There was something in his eyes, an urgency that set her on edge. Her smile faltered, and her hand instinctively went to the locket, the gesture small but telling. It was enough to push Alexander forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice strained, breaking through the buzz of post-recital chatter. Eliza's gaze met his, and for a moment, neither spoke. The noise around them seemed to dim, narrowing the space between them to a charged silence. "Yes," she replied, cautious now. The warmth she had shown moments ago was gone, replaced by a guardedness that only deepened Alexander's determination. "That locket," he began, his eyes flickering to the gold chain resting against her skin. He drew in a sharp breath, steadying himself. "Where did you get it?" Eliza blinked, taken aback by the directness of his question. She shifted her weight, fingers grazing the locket as if to confirm it was still there. "This," she said, her voice light but tinged with confusion. "It was given to me by my adoptive mother. She said it was a family heirloom." A wave of emotions swept over Alexander, cresting on the brink of disbelief and hope. He clenched his jaw, trying to keep his tone even. "Do you know where she got it?" His voice trembled, and he cursed the vulnerability slipping through his polished exterior. Eliza's eyes narrowed, the initial surprise morphing into something more reserved. She folded her arms across her chest, a subconscious shield. "No," she never said. It was just, always with her. She valued it more than anything, but when I asked, she would change the subject. I thought it was just part of her past she didn't want to revisit. The words settled like stones in Alexander's chest. Part of her past. The phrase danced on the edge of revelation, just out of reach. He let out a slow exhale, studying her face for any sign she was holding back. The theater lights dimmed further as a few custodians began tidying up, but neither of them moved. "Do you understand why this is important to me?" he asked, the harshness in his voice softening slightly. "That locket, it was my mother's. It vanished the night she died." The guardedness in Eliza's eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. Her fingers tightened on the locket, and for the first time, uncertainty cracked through her defenses. "I didn't know," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The confession hung between them, fragile and fraught with implication. Alexander's frustration gave way to a tentative hope that felt almost foreign. This woman, this stranger who had just been a part of Ava's recital, might hold the missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. Yet Eliza's reaction was genuine. She truly seemed unaware of the locket's significance. "How long have you had it?" he pressed, taking a half-step closer, the distance between them shrinking. "I've had it since I was a little girl," she replied, the words weighted with memories. "I remember finding it among my mother's things after she passed. She always told me it was special, that it came from someone important. I thought she meant someone in her own life, not..." She stopped, eyes widening slightly as the implications began to sink in. Alexander's mind raced. Pieces of his childhood resurfaced, whispered conversations behind closed doors, his father's terse avoidance of any questions about that night, and the hollow sound of the grandfather clock marking time as life moved on without answers. This woman standing in front of him was now inexplicably tied to it all. A frown creased Eliza's brow as she studied his expression. "I don't know much beyond that," she admitted, almost apologetically. The defensive edge had softened in her voice, leaving behind an earnestness that mirrored his own urgency. "My adoptive mother was a private person. She was kind, but she had secrets, I think. This locket, it was one of them." The theater was nearly empty now, the bustle of excited parents and chattering children replaced with silence that felt heavy. Alexander nodded slowly, the tension in his jaw easing just slightly. His frustration, while still simmering, began to share space with something he hadn't dared let himself feel in years, the possibility that answers were within reach. "I'm sorry for coming at you like this," he said finally, the words strained but sincere. "It's just, seeing it again after all these years. It's hard to explain what it means." Eliza's eyes softened, the wariness in her gaze shifting to understanding. "I can see that," she said, her hand falling from the locket. "If it really belonged to your mother, then maybe we can find out more together. I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you what I know." Alexander sat in his home office, a cavernous room lined with mahogany shelves and old volumes whose spines bore the stories of other families' histories but held none of the answers he sought. The moon's glow filtered through the tall windows, casting a pale, silvery light over the desk cluttered with faded photographs, old letters, and the frayed notebook that had belonged to his mother. Its pages, yellowed with age, held notes on her piano compositions, to-do lists, and snippets of poetry that once captured her fleeting moments of peace. His fingers traced the edges of an envelope, sealed yet worn with handling over the years. It was one of the few items he hadn't opened, a relic of hesitation, as if breaking the seal would also break something sacred. But tonight, with Eliza's revelation still reverberating through him, he felt the urge to finally unravel it. Earlier in the week, he'd made a decisive call to Samuel Quinn, an old acquaintance who had built a career out of finding the unfindable. Samuel was methodical, thorough, and discreet, the perfect person to peel back the layers of a mystery that had long been sealed by silence. The call had been brief. Alexander's voice betrayed none of the storm brewing inside him, but the request had been clear: trace Eliza's adoptive mother's life, find the connections, and uncover what led that locket from his childhood home to an unfamiliar woman's hands. Days passed as Alexander buried himself in the tangible pieces of his past. Each evening, when Ava had gone to bed and the quiet settled into the corners of the house, he worked through the stacks of documents from the estate's attic. Old ledgers and guest lists, invitations printed on thick cardstock, and letters exchanged with friends. He sifted through them all, looking for any clue that might explain the locket's sudden reappearance. Then, on the fifth night, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Samuel's voice was sharp and energized, cutting through the ambient hum of the city outside. "Alexander, I found something," he said, no small talk, just the urgency of discovery. Alexander's pulse quickened. "Tell me." "There's a connection." Eliza's adoptive mother, a woman named Margaret Hayes, worked as a housekeeper at the estate in the late 1970s, about 2 years before your mother passed away. She left quite suddenly, with little explanation, but not before your mother's death. Alexander sank into his chair, the room seeming to shift as memories he'd thought long dormant began to stir. He recalled Margaret, a quiet, composed woman who always wore her hair in a tight bun and moved with the kind of discretion that made her presence barely noticeable. She had been kind, he remembered, always slipping him extra biscuits when no one was watching. "Did she have any connections with my mother?" he asked, forcing himself to sound calm despite the wave of questions threatening to pull him under. Samuel paused, a slight rustle of papers on the other end. "That part's unclear. There are no records of close correspondence, but it's strange that she left around the time things fell apart for your family. It could be nothing, or it could mean she was involved in something that required her silence." Alexander's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the desk, his mother in the garden, one hand holding a bouquet of daisies, her locket glinting in the sunlight. She'd always worn it, even on the most ordinary days. The thought of Margaret possessing it, passing it to Eliza, hinted at layers he hadn't dared imagine. "Keep digging," Alexander said, his voice a mix of command and plea. "I need more." Samuel's assurance came quickly before the line disconnected, leaving the room in silence once more. But it wasn't the comfortable silence of the past few years, it was the heavy, anticipatory quiet that reminded him of waiting for answers as a child, pacing the halls as his father spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors. He turned back to the notebook, flipping through its pages until he found a sketch, hastily drawn, of the garden at the estate. His mother's handwriting scrawled across the bottom, "For secrets the heart dares not tell." It sent a shiver down his spine, an echo of the whispers he'd ignored or forgotten. The next morning, Samuel's report arrived, detailing Margaret Hayes' brief but significant employment. It highlighted that she had been more than just a housekeeper. She had been entrusted with tasks that required loyalty and discretion. One neighbor's account mentioned seeing her in deep conversation with Alexander's mother, their faces close and urgent, though the details had long faded from memory. The report also included an address, a modest house on the outskirts of town where Margaret had lived after leaving the estate. It was there she'd raised Eliza, passing on stories that remained locked in ambiguity. Alexander's fingers tightened around the pages. He needed to speak to Eliza again, and soon. Questions burned in him like embers. Why Margaret? Why had she left so suddenly, and why had she taken the locket? The idea that there was a secret guarded so fiercely that it spanned decades made his heart pound with a mix of dread and anticipation. He gathered the report in his mother's notebook, his movements brisk with newfound purpose. The truth was no longer a distant hope, it was close, tangled in the stories of the people who had once filled his childhood home. And if Margaret Hayes had been the key to protecting those secrets, then Eliza might be the final piece that could unravel it all. Eliza sat at a small table in the cafe, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea as she glanced around, wary but curious. The light filtering through the large window cast a soft glow on her face, revealing both caution and something deeper, an unspoken need to know why a man like Alexander had chased this lead so fervently. The cafe hummed with the low murmur of conversations, the clinking of cutlery, and the hiss of the espresso machine, but for Eliza, the noise was background to the man now standing in the doorway. Alexander's entrance drew a few eyes, his presence commanding even in the most ordinary settings. He spotted her and moved through the maze of tables, each step deliberate, carrying with it the weight of anticipation. He settled into the chair across from her, the tension between them like a thread pulled taut. "Thank you for meeting me," Alexander said, his voice quieter than she expected. The powerful businessman from the recital seemed different now, less imposing, more human. "I need to understand why this locket means so much to you," Eliza said, lifting her chin, challenging him to explain. She didn't come here just for answers, she came because of the look in his eyes when he'd confronted her. It was as if her own life had been wound into his without either of them knowing. Alexander exhaled, eyes momentarily drifting to the delicate gold pendant at her throat. "That locket belonged to my mother. It vanished the night she died, and no one could tell me what happened. Your adoptive mother, Margaret Hayes, worked at our estate. She might have known more than anyone else." He leaned forward, voice tightening with urgency. "Eliza, I believe you were at the estate as a child." Her brows knit together as she considered his words. The locket had always felt significant, a piece of her mother's past that was never explained, only cherished. "I remember her wearing it, always touching it, but I never asked where it came from. After she passed, I found it tucked away in an old box." She paused, a hint of pain flickering across her eyes. She must have kept it hidden for a reason. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. Eliza took a sip of tea, trying to steady herself as flashes of childhood memories surfaced. "I have these fragments in my mind," she began hesitantly, as if peeling back layers that had long been sealed. "Playing in a garden with tall hedges, voices that felt familiar even though I couldn't place them. And a woman's voice reading stories. I used to think they were just dreams." Alexander's heart pounded as he absorbed her words. The estate's garden was vast, with hedges that had hidden secret paths and small stone benches where his mother would sit with him, reading fairy tales under the dappled sunlight. "That garden was my mother's favorite place," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "She would spend hours there, reading to me, telling me stories." Eliza's eyes widened as recognition bloomed, a subtle tremor running through her fingers. "I remember laughter. Someone was always laughing, warm and soft, like music. And I remember a boy, dark hair, always looking serious." Alexander swallowed hard. It was like hearing echoes of a past he'd thought only he remembered. The boy was him, unsmiling, absorbing the world with a gravity that felt beyond his years. "That was me," he said, barely above a whisper. "You must have been there, Eliza." The realization sent a jolt through her, a mix of confusion and longing. She searched his face for answers. The man she'd known only as a powerful figure in town now layered with history that intertwined with her own. But why would my mother keep it from me? Why hide that part of her life? He shook his head, frustration creeping into the lines of his face. That's what I don't know. Margaret was trusted. She was more than just a housekeeper. If she took you away from the estate, it wasn't on a whim. There must have been a reason. The questions that once haunted his childhood were now reassembled into something more urgent, bound to Eliza's story. Eliza's hand drifted to the locket, her thumb tracing its familiar curves. The room around them seemed to blur as she tried to fit the jagged pieces of memory into place. She was always fiercely protective, but she never explained why. I thought it was just who she was, a mother with secrets. The cafe door swung open, letting in a brief gust of cool air that shook them from their reverie. Alexander leaned back, studying Eliza with new eyes. The guardedness she'd shown at first had softened, replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored his own. There's more to this than we know, he said, determination hardening in his expression. We need to find out why she left, what she was protecting you from. Eliza nodded, the fear that had lingered on the edges of her life now joined by a cautious hope. Maybe it's time to stop wondering and start finding out. The air between them shifted, no longer heavy with questions but with the anticipation of discovery. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the distant hum of possibility, the sense that what had been lost could be found again, not just for him, but for both of them. The answers were out there, somewhere in the echoes of the past, waiting to be uncovered. Alexander paced the length of his office, the scent of old paper and polished wood surrounding him like a shroud. Stacks of weathered letters and faded photographs cluttered the mahogany desk, each piece a key to a history he hadn't dared to confront until now. Samuel's latest report sat in the center, pages crisp and stark against the scattered mess. In his hands, he clutched a series of letters that Samuel had uncovered, delicate sheets of stationery, ink smudged where emotion had pressed too hard. With a steadying breath, Alexander unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, his mother's elegant script, loops that once traced birthday cards and notes slipped under his door before school recitals. But these words were different, urgent and heavy. My dearest Margaret, one letter began, I fear the days are running short. The eyes that watch this house are not kind, and I must act quickly to protect what is most precious. You have always been my confidant, and I entrust this to you because I know you will keep her safe. Alexander's eyes blurred at the inked confession. The hurt in question became clearer as he read on. His mother had written of a daughter, a child born of a secret relationship that, if revealed, would fracture the fragile world she had been bound to. Margaret Hayes was the one chosen to protect this truth, to raise the girl as her own and keep her from the whispers that could destroy them all. The room seemed to tilt, a rush of realization sweeping over him. Eliza was his sister. The threads of mystery that had wound around them both suddenly wove into a story that explained the fragments of Eliza's memories and the hidden looks exchanged in the quiet corners of the estate. His hands trembled as he placed the letters back on the desk. He leaned heavily against it, staring at the collection of documents that had so effortlessly shattered the life he thought he understood. The weight of grief for his mother mixed with a strange, poignant sense of reunion. She had tried to protect them both, leaving pieces behind that he now grasped in his unsteady hands. The next morning, Alexander called Eliza. The brief conversation was laced with urgency and nerves, but she agreed to meet him at the estate. The old mansion, with its stone walls and long, shaded hallways, felt almost alive with history as they walked through the front door. Eliza stood in the entrance hall, her expression wary but open. You said you found something, she asked, her voice cautious. Yes, Alexander replied, his tone more tender than he intended. He motioned for her to follow him to the sitting room, where the letters were laid out. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the delicate papers. He picked up the first letter and handed it to her, the one where their mother's resolve was laid bare. Eliza's eyes scanned the words, and as she read, her fingers tightened on the edges. The confusion in her gaze melted into understanding, and then into something deeper, an ache that mirrored his own. "She was my mother too," she whispered, barely audible. The words came out fractured, as if saying them aloud made them real. Alexander reached out, hesitant, but when she didn't pull away, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Yes," he said, his voice shaking. "She tried to keep you safe, Eliza. Margaret took you in because our mother asked her to." Tears filled Eliza's eyes, and she set the letter down, one hand covering her mouth as memories surfaced. Images of playing in the garden, a woman's voice reading stories, and a gentle touch that felt familiar now clicked into place. "I always wondered why Margaret looked at me the way she did, so protective, like there was more to her love than just being a mother. And now I know." The silence between them was thick with shared sorrow and revelation. Alexander sank into an armchair, the fabric worn under his grip. "I spent years thinking I was alone in this house," he admitted, the confession raw. "Not knowing that my sister was out there, somewhere, living a life separate from the past that shaped us." Eliza moved to sit across from him, their eyes meeting with a new understanding. "I used to dream of this place," she said, voice breaking as she glanced around the room. "I thought they were just dreams, stories my mind made up. But they were memories." Alexander nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "Our mother made sure you wouldn't be swallowed by the weight of what this place held. She wanted you to have more than what was expected, more than what was controlled by those who watched and whispered." They sat together, the sunlight shifting as the day waned. There were still questions, puzzles they'd need to piece together, and answers that could only be found in the stories passed down or hidden away. But in that moment, they were more than two strangers connected by a locket. They were family, rediscovering a bond that had been deliberately obscured, but not lost. The estate loomed before them, its grandeur softened by age. Ivy crept along the stone walls, twisting over the windows that once framed scenes of childhood and laughter. Alexander had seen this place as a fortress for so long, a keeper of secrets and echoes. But now, with Eliza beside him, it felt different. The sun hung low, painting the sky with strokes of amber and lavender, casting long, thoughtful shadows across the gardens. Eliza stepped carefully over the cobblestones, eyes wide with wonder and unease. The scent of lavender and old roses reached them, pulling at memories she hadn't known were real until now. "It's strange," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember this place, but only in pieces, like flashes of light in the dark." Alexander nodded, his gaze softening as he watched her take in the grounds. He led her through the gardens, past the hedges that once hid his youthful games and solitary moments. Each step seemed to unearth something, a half-forgotten laugh, the rustle of skirts, the murmur of voices lost to time. They stopped by a stone bench, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Eliza reached out, fingers brushing the stone as a tear threatened to spill. "I used to sit here," she said, eyes distant. "There was a woman with a voice like summer. She would tell me stories, and I'd watch the butterflies dance." "That was our mother," Alexander said, his throat tight with emotion. "She always had a way of weaving stories, making everything feel like a fairy tale." A gust of wind rustled the leaves, as if the estate itself was listening. Just then, the crunch of gravel signaled the approach of someone else. From the far end of the garden, an elderly man walked toward them, his gait slow but purposeful. His hair was white as the frost that sometimes graced the early mornings, and his eyes, deep-set and kind, carried years of unspoken thoughts. "Mr. Alexander," the gardener said, tipping his hat slightly. His gaze shifted to Eliza, lingering with a hint of recognition. "It's been many years, hasn't it?" "Yes, Thomas," Alexander replied, his voice steadying. "This is Eliza. We were hoping to learn more about what happened back then." Thomas nodded, taking a breath as he leaned on his cane. "I always wondered," he began, eyes glistening as they settled on Eliza. "The little girl who used to play in the gardens. You were only a child, but I remember you well." His gaze softened as the memories seemed to flow back into the present. "Margaret, your adoptive mother, was a strong woman. She was the one who kept watch over you after the arguments." "Arguments?" Alexander's brow furrowed, the term crackling like a spark against old kindling. "Yes," Thomas said, shifting his weight. "Your mother and Margaret had words that last night she was here. I didn't hear everything, but there were tears and raised voices. Margaret left with you shortly after, saying it was best for everyone. We all assumed it was a misunderstanding or a family matter that needed mending." He sighed, the sound heavy with years of not knowing. "But then she never came back." Eliza's hand trembled as she absorbed Thomas's story. Her childhood suddenly felt like a puzzle whose missing pieces had been sitting just out of reach. The woman who raised her had always been protective, fierce even, and now Eliza understood why. Margaret's love had been both a shield and a sacrifice. "So, Margaret took me away to protect me," Eliza said, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and sadness. "But from what?" The elderly gardener looked at Alexander, his eyes serious and knowing. "From those who wouldn't understand," he said gently. "Your mother feared the consequences. The estate had eyes, ears, and expectations. If word of a child born outside those bounds had gotten out, it would have shattered more than just reputations." Alexander felt the ground beneath him shift as the truths he'd sought began to slot into place. His mother's decision hadn't been driven by shame, it had been an act of fierce love and protection. And Margaret, loyal, steadfast Margaret, had upheld that wish, even if it meant disappearing into the fabric of another life. Eliza wiped at her eyes, the tears finally breaking free. "I don't know how to feel," she admitted, voice wavering as she looked at Alexander. "I mourned the mother who raised me, and now I'm mourning someone I barely remember but who is just as much a part of me." Alexander stepped closer, their shared grief binding them in a way words never could. "You're not alone," he said. "Not anymore. We can piece this together, all of it, but we'll do it together." Thomas nodded approvingly, his gaze sweeping over the garden that had once held so many secrets. "It's good to see the two of you here. The past holds weight, but it's up to you to decide what to carry forward." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in twilight. The estate, once a monument to silence, now resonated with something new, a sense of hope intertwined with the bittersweet truth. As the evening air settled, Eliza reached for Alexander's hand, squeezing it tightly, an unspoken agreement that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The estate hummed with new life as Thanksgiving Day approached. The chill in the air was tempered by the golden hues of the autumn leaves that rustled gently outside the tall windows. Alexander stood at the entrance of the grand dining hall, watching as the staff made final adjustments to the table. The mahogany surface gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier, its light reflecting off the polished silverware and heirloom china that hadn't been used in years. This time, though, the setting was not a relic of formality but an invitation to begin anew. Eliza arrived in a soft sweater the color of deep plum, her eyes wide as she took in the transformed room. It was surreal to see the estate so vibrant, filled with the sounds of guests arriving and the clatter of dishes. This was no longer just a place with walls that guarded secrets. Tonight, it would become a place of belonging. "Thank you for doing this," she said, stepping beside Alexander, her voice gentle but steady. He looked at her, the weight of the past weeks evident in his expression but softened by a rare smile. "It's time," he said simply. And it was. The estate deserved laughter, conversation, and the sounds of a family reclaiming what was lost. As the evening unfolded, friends and distant relatives filled the room, the air humming with conversation and the rich scents of roasted turkey, spiced cranberries, and freshly baked bread. Eliza found herself surrounded by people whose names she didn't yet know but who smiled and welcomed her warmly. It was strange to feel a sense of belonging in a place that had been a mystery for so long. At the head of the table, Alexander rose, glass in hand. The room quieted, the chatter fading as everyone turned their attention to him. He cleared his throat, his gaze moving over the familiar faces, then settling on Eliza. "Tonight is more than just a celebration of Thanksgiving," he began, voice deep and resonant. "It's a celebration of finding each other and rediscovering the stories that make us who we are." The room remained hushed, the weight of his words sinking in. He continued, "Our mother, Eleanor, was the heart of this home. She had a way of making each moment feel special, whether it was through music, stories, or just her presence. She would have loved seeing us all here, filling this space with laughter again." A murmur of agreement swept the table, and Alexander's eyes misted over briefly before he blinked it away. "When we were children," he said, looking at Eliza, "she would read us stories in the garden. I didn't know then that those stories reached further than I imagined. But now I see that the love she shared didn't end with me, it found its way to you too." Eliza's chest tightened, the emotions swirling within her catching her off guard. She felt the warmth of eyes on her, but it wasn't scrutiny, it was acceptance. She raised her glass, a small but genuine smile forming. "I may not have known Eleanor as you did, but Margaret, my adoptive mother, carried her strength. She protected me fiercely and gave me a sense of worth that I'll always be grateful for. Now I understand that love doesn't diminish, it only grows, and it connected us, even when we didn't know." The room exhaled in a collective sigh, and a few soft chuckles rippled through as the tension gave way to a shared understanding. People began to share stories of Eleanor, tales of her teaching piano to the local children, making homemade remedies for colds, and insisting everyone dance at least once during any gathering. Laughter mixed with tears as the evening deepened, and the boundaries that once defined them softened. For the first time in years, the estate felt like more than a house, it felt like a home. Alexander watched Eliza as she spoke with an elderly aunt who recounted stories from before she was born. The shadows in Eliza's eyes seemed to lift, replaced by a light that hinted at peace. After dinner, plates were cleared, and dessert appeared in the form of pumpkin pie and cinnamon-laced apple tarts. Ava, wearing a sparkly headband that caught the light every time she moved, insisted on saying what she was thankful for. She stood on her chair, her small voice bright and unrestrained. "I'm thankful for Daddy, and for the stories he tells me, and for Aunt Eliza because she's new but already feels like family," she declared, her smile wide enough to reveal a missing tooth. The room erupted into warm applause, and Eliza's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. She reached out, taking Ava's hand as a tender laugh escaped her. "I'm thankful for you too," she whispered, squeezing her little fingers. As the night wound down, guests drifted toward the sitting room, cups of coffee and tea in hand. Eliza found Alexander by the grand piano, fingers tracing the keys lightly. She stepped closer, catching the note of nostalgia in his eyes. "Do you play?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. He nodded, a smile playing at his lips. "Our mother taught me. I haven't played in a long time, though." "Maybe it's time you did," she suggested, a hint of challenge in her voice. With a breath, Alexander sat and began to play a piece he remembered from childhood, the soft, lilting notes weaving through the air. It was imperfect, but it was theirs. Eliza joined him, not in music, but in the silence that was no longer empty. For that evening, surrounded by stories, laughter, and the hum of quiet conversations, they were more than the fragments of a past mended by discovery. They were a family, rediscovered and finally whole. The next morning, sunlight poured into the sitting room, casting a warm glow over the faded photographs and books lining the shelves. Alexander stood by the window, the sounds of the estate waking up drifting through the glass. He glanced down at the small, gilded frame in his hands, a portrait of their mother, Eleanor, holding the locket that had brought so much change. The painting had been found tucked away in a chest, the colors still vibrant as if it had waited for this moment. Footsteps behind him pulled Alexander from his thoughts. Eliza appeared, her expression curious yet softened with the comfort of familiarity. The past few weeks had transformed them both, peeling back years of uncertainty to reveal a bond that was strong despite the time lost. "I wanted to show you something," Alexander said, turning to her. He offered the portrait, his hand steady as he passed it to her. Eliza took it, eyes widening as she traced her mother's face, a face she had only known through the blurred edges of memory and now saw clear and full of life. "Alexander, this is beautiful," she whispered, voice trembling. The image seemed to reach across time, stitching together moments she'd never lived but felt connected to, as though a hidden chapter of her story had finally been opened. "I thought you should have this," he said, a hint of emotion tugging at his usually composed tone. "It's always been part of our home, but now it's a part of yours too." The locket painted around their mother's neck gleamed under the painted sunlight, mirroring the real one that now lay against Eliza's chest. Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them back, a smile breaking through. "It feels like she's here with us," Eliza said. The room settled into a peaceful silence, the kind that spoke more than words could. With the portrait held close, Eliza felt the unspoken promise of their mother's love, no longer confined to whispers or shadows but embraced in the open. Later that afternoon, the dining hall filled once again, this time for a more intimate gathering. Plates clinked, and laughter rippled across the table as stories from the previous night were retold with even more dramatic flourishes. Ava ran between chairs, carrying napkins and spreading her joy like sunshine, her giggles sparking smiles all around. Alexander rose from his seat, the room gradually quieting as the guests looked to him. He lifted his glass, catching Eliza's eye before scanning the familiar and new faces. "To family," he began, his voice confident but touched with warmth. "To the ones we've known, the ones we've missed, and the ones we find when we least expect it. Life is filled with unexpected turns, but it's the people who walk with us through those turns who make us whole." He glanced at Ava, who beamed back at him, eyes bright. Then his gaze returned to Eliza, who nodded, tears shining but unfallen. "May we always remember that the past shapes us, but it's the choices we make now that define us. Here's to truth, to second chances, and to the bonds that time and distance can't break." The room burst into applause, glasses clinking as conversations resumed, animated and full of life. Eliza raised her glass, the portrait set on a nearby table catching her eye. The locket on her chest felt warm, no longer a mystery or a burden, but a symbol of connection that spanned more than just her own story. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in a soft twilight, Alexander, Eliza, and Ava wandered out to the garden. The paths that once held secrets now felt open, the air filled with the gentle hum of leaves and the scent of autumn. Ava skipped ahead, her little shoes crunching on the gravel, while Eliza and Alexander walked side by side. The silence between them was easy, filled with the knowledge of what they had found. The locket caught the last rays of light, glistening as Eliza turned to Alexander with a smile. "It feels right, doesn't it?" she said, the question more of an affirmation. "It does," Alexander replied, a rare, unguarded smile breaking across his face. The estate, once a place of shadows and whispered stories, was now a place of shared memories and laughter. They reached the stone bench where their mother had once read stories, and Ava clambered onto it, declaring it her castle seat. Eliza laughed, and Alexander joined, the sound deep and true.